hour. First, though, time now is 6 minutes past 11. A man who raped a 13-year-old girl when he was 17 years old has been given a community sentence instead of prison. 21-year-old Sean Hogg attacked the girl in a country park in Dalkeith in Mid Lothian. He attacked her on various occasions over a 3-month period. The judge, Lord Lake, said that if the offence had been committed by an adult over the age of 25, he would have received a jail sentence of 4 or 5 years. Instead, Hogg has been ordered to do 270 hours of unpaid work. This comes after new guidelines for sentencing under 25s were introduced in Scotland last year. We're going to talk about this. We'll talk to Thomas Leonard Ross, KC, who's from Benchmark Advocates in Glasgow and is the former president of the Scottish Criminal Bar Association. Thomas, good morning to you.
Good morning, Naga.
Morning. Sandy Brindley is the Chief Executive of Rape Crisis Scotland. Sandy, hello.
Good morning.
And Emma Jardine is the Policy and Public Affairs Advisor for Howard League Scotland, which campaigns for reform within the criminal justice system. Emma, good morning.
Good morning, Naga.
Thomas, can I begin with you?
Sure.
You've been, overseeing High Court cases for more than 2 decades. Your reaction to this?
Well, it's the first time I've seen somebody escape a prison sentence under these circumstances, so it's an extremely unusual sentence. The judge himself said that had the offender been a fully developed adult, then the sentence would have been 4 or 5 years imprisonment. And that's the type of sentence which is normally imposed in Scotland in relation to these cases. So the sentence selected by the judge is extremely unusual.
Okay, why has the judge opted for this sentence? I'm not asking you to kind of look into the judge's mind, but in terms of the law.
Well, in Scotland, a sentencing guideline was introduced in January of last year, which bound the judges to take account of the guideline in relation to the sentencing of any person who was under the age of 25 at the time when they were found guilty, essentially. And in that sentencing guideline, it made it clear 2 things which are relevant. Firstly, a young person should receive a lesser sentence than a fully developed adult. And secondly, rehabilitation was described as a primary consideration. And it's clear from the judge's remarks that he took the view that rehabilitation was more likely to be achieved by a non-custodial sentence than by sending him to prison, which would be the normal outcome.
Many times we've spoken on this programme about the conviction rates for rape. What are they in Scotland?
I don't know the percentage, but certainly a lot of people are convicted. This individual went to trial and claimed that the girl had consented and was convicted by the jury. So I'm happy that in every case where the evidence proves the case beyond reasonable doubt that people are convicted, and to me the percentage isn't that important.
But it is important if you're looking at people who are going to report rapes and go through the system to actually get a conviction.
Well, I don't think anybody would want people to be convicted who were innocent. And obviously, in every case where there is a trial, there are competing versions. So typically, the accused will usually say that the intercourse was consensual, and the person making the complaint will say that it's non-consensual. And the question is whether the jury are satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that guilt's been proved. That's what I meant by it.
Okay. Sandy, your reaction to this sentence, this 270 hours of unpaid work, a non-custodial sentence?
I think this is a completely extraordinary sentence to give someone who's been convicted of such a serious crime against a 13-year-old girl. I think in terms of broader justice responses to rape, what we know is rape is particularly underreported, and it's because people worry about not being taken seriously, and that is exactly the message that I think this sentence gives. It's about just how serious or not the justice system takes the crime of rape. Rape has got the lowest conviction rate of any crime type in Scotland. We know that most cases don't get to court.
Do you know the conviction rate?
Sorry?
Do you know the conviction rate?
Yeah, it's just over 50% of cases that get to court, which is much, much lower than the average conviction rate, which sits in the high 80s for all crime. And I don't share the confidence of Tommy Rose that every guilty man is convicted based on the evidence. I think there are real issues with access to justice in Scotland following on from rape, and I think there's a real issue with jury attitudes to the crime of rape that do influence their decision making. I think there is a real concern about guilty men walking free, but the irony in this case is a guilty man has walked free after a jury found him guilty.
Indeed. Can I pick you up on, you just said the jury attitudes. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, there's really extensive research now using mock jury trials internationally that finds that jury members or potential jury members are using rape myths as part of their decision making. So preconceived ideas about what rape is or how somebody should react during or after a rape, that these influence decision making, so that the concern is that decisions are not being made based on the evidence or not based purely on the evidence that's led at trial. The evidence has been filtered through preconceived ideas, or sometimes I would say outright prejudice or misogyny, and that is leading to a very low conviction rate, and guilty men, in my view, absolutely definitely walking free from the Scottish justice system.
Thomas, could you clear something up for me just in terms of the law? I mean, this isn't only shocking because this man raped this girl, but she was 13. Does that not even add anything to this in terms of the sentence?
I think the judge actually said in his sentencing remarks that that was identified by him as an aggravating factor, and we would all hope that it would be identified as an aggravating factor when she's so young. So you're right to characterise it as a factor which makes it much, much more serious. Undoubtedly, I would like to say I'm not suggesting that every guilty man is convicted. What I'm saying is, in every case where the evidence produced proves the case beyond reasonable doubt, that the accused is convicted. There hasn't been any research in relation to jurors in Scotland. Sandy knows that. What Sandy's talking about is students pretending to be jurors. In England, they've had a much more mature response where they have spoken to actual jurors. They haven't done that in Scotland, and Sandy knows that. So
I think that's
to suggest
a complete mischaracterisation of the evidence, Tommy, and you know that.
Well, sorry, Sandy. Can you just clear up because Sandy, you did say that I did ask you about the kind of the idea of juries' perceptions. Can you just clear up where your kind of research came from?
Yeah, so Fiona Leverick, who's a professor of law at Glasgow University, carried out an analysis of all the existing international research using mock juries, not students, but randomly selected members of the public. And what she found was there was overwhelming evidence that rape myths were influencing jury decision making. The research that Tommy is referencing and that was carried out in England using actual jurors, they were not jurors from rape trials, and effectively what that research did was ask people, did you apply prejudice to your decision making? And I think most people in those circumstances would say no. So we are restricted. Tommy Ross is right. We're restricted in being able to question jurors from actual rape trials because of the Contempt of Court Act, but there has been such extensive mock jury research and really credible and reputable mock jury research that shows that there is a concern here. Enough evidence, certainly, I think, for us to listen and pay heed to.
Right. Emma, morning to you. Emma Jardine, Policy and Public Affairs Advisor for Howard League Scotland, which campaigns for reform within the criminal justice system. Emma, when I first saw this story, my first thought was there is a man who has raped a 13-year-old who is being given community service, and I should add, as well as the 270 hours of community work, Hogg has also been put under supervision and on the sex offenders register for 3 years. Regardless, he's out on the streets after raping someone multiple times. How is this seen as okay?
Well, the judge has acknowledged that rape is one of the most serious crimes that can be committed. He has been found guilty. He has not walked free from court, as you say. He is under supervision. He will be very strictly monitored. He will be under subject to risk assessments. That is not to say that this was not a serious crime. It was a 13-year-old girl. He was 17.
It's heinous. It's heinous.
It is a very, very serious crime. And the judge's reflections support that. It is unusual. I absolutely agree with what Thomas has said. It is an unusual sentence, but it is one that is open to the court under these sentencing guidelines.
What good are these changes to sentencing bringing about?
So just to go back a step in terms of rehabilitation and the fact that he is walking free. He is, but a decision has been made.
And I should say that the judge said, prison does not lead me to believe this will contribute to your rehabilitation. You are a first offender with no previous history of prison. You are 21 and were 27 at the time. I don't consider... he says, for this offence, if committed by an adult over 20 or 25, you attract a sentence of 4 or 5 years. I don't consider that appropriate and don't intend to send you to prison.
There is something in that the situation we find ourselves in Scottish prisons at the moment does not support any ideals of rehabilitation. There are enormous waiting lists. There are more than 700 people on waiting lists for offending behaviour programmes in our prisons in Scotland. Our prisons are very overcrowded. They are understaffed in many respects. We have to be clear here that he would not be rehabilitated or would be very unlikely to be rehabilitated in the Scottish prison system as it stands.
So the answer is not to send them to prison because prison doesn't work. But what?
Well, we know that prison doesn't work. Prison in itself is criminogenic. For this type of sentence, he is unlikely to be reformed in any way. However, we need then to understand why there is an appetite to send him to prison. And the appetite for that is based on the seriousness of the crime, yes, and some kind of form of retribution. And that's not necessarily helpful in preventing reoffending. So the judge has made a decision on the basis of all the information that has been given to him, including community justice social worker reports, community-based justice social reports, and so on, and therefore has made what he believes to be the best decision in the interests of reduction of future reoffending and rehabilitation.
Is a woman in Scotland, in the area where this man lives, as safer or less safe with him on the streets or in prison?
She should be safe on the basis of the restrictions that he is under. He's under very strict.
Is she as safe as if he were in prison?
She is going to be. She is potentially less safe if he were to go to prison, not be rehabilitated, and then be released as an angry young man with feelings of injustice. Again, we've got to remember here, it is a 13-year-old child. It was a very, very serious offence. However, sending somebody like him to prison for a short period of time is very unlikely to reduce future risk of reoffending. And the data shows that community sentences are more effective in preventing reoffending than custodial sentences.
Sandy, I wonder if the focus... You tell me, is the focus correct? So let's not make a young man who didn't have a prison record before, who has raped a 13-year-old, go to prison and be further influenced, made angry, as Emma said, and we understand that that many people who go to prison come out with worse characters than when they went in, or do you fix the prison system?
So I think there are legitimate criticisms to be made of the prison service, of overcrowding, of ability to go into sex offender rehabilitation programmes. But I think there's a couple of points there. One is, how does somebody being given community service effectively address their sexual offending behaviour? I have not seen any evidence suggesting that would be the case. But also, as important as rehabilitation is, it should not be the only factor or the only function of the justice system. And I really do disagree with the characterisation of rape survivors wanting their offender to go to jail as being about retribution. I think it is about seeking justice and some acknowledgement of harm. And also what rape survivors tell us is that they feel safe. That is a period where they feel safe and they don't have to worry about the offender is because they're in jail. So I think notions of retribution aren't necessarily helpful in this case when we're talking about the crime of rape. But fundamentally, I think what the justice system has said in this case is that the interests of rape survivors must always be completely peripheral to the needs of the offender, and I don't think that's right.
I thought that, if you're a victim of crime, you want the criminal off the streets. That's what jail does.
Yeah,
it's as simple as that, isn't it?
Absolutely. That is very much what rape survivors say it is. Part of their motivation about reporting the crime in the first place is to stop it happening to someone else. And how does this sentence effectively stop it happening to someone else, or give any sense of justice or safety for the individual in this case?
We've had texts coming in and emails, actually. Rob in Suffolk says, so sentencing of offenders is now based on what is right for the offender. Sometimes I'm just left shaking my head. Thomas?
Yeah, no, that's a very reasonable point, because the sentencing guideline which we've been discussing is only one of the sentencing guidelines which have been issued in Scotland. And there is another one which sets out the sort of purposes of sentencing. And one of the purposes of sentencing is punishment, and another purpose of sentencing is protection of the public, and a third one is to give society an opportunity to express disapproval of offending behaviour. Now,
so has any of this sentence done that?
Well, the concern in the public discussion of this case is that it hasn't done any of that. Because ultimately, and what I would like to, I've got tremendous respect for the judge. The judge is incredibly well respected at the bar, so I'm sure he has his reasons for what he did. But the reason I think there is such disquiet about it is that people do not think that it adequately expresses society's disapproval of raping 13-year-olds when you get the same sentence as you get for vandalising a bus shelter.
Kevin from Hereford has messaged, hello Naga, I think that the judge got it wrong, and anyone who commits rape should be sent to prison for at least 5 to 10 years. Rapists should not be sent back / let loose on the streets where they could reoffend regardless of any restrictions put in place on them. Thomas, just in terms of the law and the sentencing, Kevin thinks 5 to 10 years. What is it now?
Well, the judge said it would have been 4 or 5 years had he been a fully mature adult, and that's about right. I should say that the Crown Office in Scotland took appeals in December in which they argued that it was really concerned sort of partner rapes, and they argued that the rape sentences for those type of cases were inadequate, that they were too low, and were successful in some of the cases. So there is a concern in the prosecution system in Scotland that the sentences for rape are insufficient, and certainly this sentence will cause them to reflect whether it's necessary for them to appeal against the sentence, and they have the right to do that.
Sandy, we've spoken about the process on this programme and I've spoken to women who have been sexually assaulted, raped, who have gone through the process and honestly been through hell. And to report a rape and to go through the court process is harrowing. Do you think this will put off potential victim survivors or existing victim survivors from reporting rape?
Yeah, I think that is a genuine worry about the impact of this case. If anybody's watching who has been raped and who's thinking about reporting it, I would understand why they might think, why should I put myself through that for this to be the outcome? I mean, this case took 4 years to get to court. I mean, if you think about the impact of that on any victim, never mind a 13-year-old girl, of having the prospect of having to give evidence in a rape trial hanging over you for 4 years, it is a very, very, very difficult process.
And she would have done this with school friends knowing, with her community knowing, and all sorts of opinions being thrown at her.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are specific issues when it's children or young people reporting rape, because it is very, particularly when it's one of their peers or another young person from their community, because it's very, very difficult. For example, at school, when even though people are anonymous or they're not named through the process, in smaller communities, people often know what is happening, and I think that can be extremely difficult. And then to see somebody walking free, I think that is hard to see how that could feel like a real acknowledgement of the harm that's been done. And my understanding is there's been no acknowledgement of harm from the offender in this case. So it seems very hard to me to see how you could build any kind of rehabilitation without a basic acknowledgement of harm.
Yeah, I don't have any response, actually. I don't have any details about how Hogg responded. I should say a spokesperson for the Crown Office, which is, of course, Scotland's Public Prosecution Office, said, as with all cases, the Crown will consider the sentence and give consideration to whether it might be unduly lenient. Emma, are we going to... This is the start of a conversation. Obviously, this is the first time we've seen a sentence like this in Scotland for a rapist. Are we going to have to get used to and almost change our attitudes in society to how rapists are sentenced?
No, I don't think so. I think, as always, the independence of the judiciary is sacrosanct, and that it is on a case-by-case basis. I wouldn't suggest that this is the start of a trend in any way, and I wouldn't lay that at Judge Lord Lake's door at all. Sentencing decisions have to be made on an individualised basis, on the basis of the information in front of him or her, and that has been done here. I wouldn't think that we have to get used to, as a society, thinking that rapists will attract lower sentences than members of the public may expect them to, and I don't think that is helpful. If we are to broaden the conversation, though, it would be good to broaden the conversation to try and understand better what will reduce the likelihood of potential further crime.
What does this man have to live with, Hogg, now? Because, yes, he's been given these 270 hours of community service. What else? How else will he be affected? He has a criminal record now, yeah?
He has a criminal record. He's on the sex offenders register for 3 years. He'll be subject...
Why only 3 years?
That's the guideline of it. I'm not absolutely sure of the details of it, because the crime was committed when he was 17, but he's not been sentenced. He was sentenced as a 21-year-old. I would go back to echo Sandy's comment. Is completely correct that that's far too long for there to be a report of a crime and then a court backlog so long that 4 years has passed. That the system should not work as slowly as that. That's a poor way to serve justice for the victim as well.
Thomas, considering we're discussing this here on national radio, we've had a flavour just from some of our listeners. Yeah. Is there a chance that this case, will be overturned?
I think, almost in a way, I hope for the sake of Lord Lake that there is an appeal, because it will at least give him the opportunity to explain the course that he took. I mean, I'm sure if he was able to come on your programme, he would do a better job than me of explaining why he did what he did, but he's not allowed to do that. And therefore the only chance he will get to explain it, I suppose, will be if there is an appeal.
I do wonder if actually the umbrage that will be taken about this sentencing, it won't be just against Judge Lake. It will be against the changes in the law, the changes in the sentencing guidelines.
Well, it's maybe a slight exaggeration to describe it as a change in the law. It's a guideline.
Yeah, I corrected myself. Apologies.
No, I wasn't meaning to correct you. I just mean that the judge wasn't bound to do this, and in fact, all the judges take the guidelines into account, but most of the judges give rapists the jail. So that this is quite an unusual course to take. Just to pick up on something Sandy said, she spoke about the response of Hogg, and she said if he wasn't acknowledging his guilt, then it would be difficult to see how there could be rehabilitation. Well, I only know two things about his response. In the first place, he went to trial and argued that the wee girl had consented to sexual intercourse. And yesterday, when he was sentenced, his senior counsel took the unusual course of telling the court that it was his intention to appeal against conviction. So that's a fairly clear statement that he doesn't accept any guilt in relation to the incident, and I suppose that might have an impact on how effectively he can be rehabilitated.
Sandy, final word to you. Why would anyone listening to this report? I know you've touched upon this already, but give them a reason.
I think the important thing to say is that although it's a difficult process, you do not have to go through it on your own. We have trained advocacy workers that if you do decide you want to report, can support you every step of the process. So I would say if you're unsure or you're concerned, please contact a support agency like Rape Crisis, and we can help you through it. And in the meantime, I think we do need to continue to campaign to improve justice responses to rape.
Sandy Brindley, Chief Executive of Rape Crisis Scotland, Thomas Leonard Rosk, KC from Benchmark Advocates in Glasgow, former President of the Scottish Criminal Bar Association, Emma Jardine, Policy and Public Affairs Advisor for Howard League Scotland, which campaigns for reform within the criminal justice system. This has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you all for the time you spent with me here on the programme.